Hi there. Good morning. My name is Genevieve Greinetz, and I am so glad to be with you for Orot's special Ushpizin video teachings for Sukkot this year. So I today wanted to talk with you about Yosef, the indwelling guest of today. And I want to start out by saying that contrary to what I take to be popular belief, and maybe people being not the biggest fans of Yosef, I will say that I might be the biggest fan of Yosef. A couple of years ago, my Hebrew name is Rachel, and a couple of years ago I added Yosef onto my name. I was wanting to add a name, and Yosef was the one. I thought about it for years, and finally was bold and brave enough to do it. And sometimes it's hard for me to articulate what it is that resonates so much with me about the Yosef story, but I want to share a little bit of that with you this day. So Yosef is an interesting presence, and what I want to focus on the most is his ability to ingather. So we know from Parshat Michetz that Yosef becomes the Pharaoh's kind of right-hand person, and Pharaoh even acknowledges to Yosef that he has all this power, but that it would be nothing without Yosef. And so he elects Yosef to be his kind of right-hand person, and then tells Yosef to harvest and to prepare for the 7 years of famine that will follow the 7 years of fertility that Yosef knows of. And we know too from that parsha that there's a quote that says, Yosef collected produce in very large quantity, like the sands of the sea, until he ceased to need it. Until he ceased to be able to measure it, for it could not be measured. So Yosef had this ability to gather enough produce to kind of equal the sands of the sea, an immeasurable amount. He was able to harvest to the point of nourishing all of the nations at that time. So it's really interesting. So what happens in this story is that Yosef is gifted with some foresight. He's able to see that there's going to be 7 years of good, fertile land, as we know from the text. But then Yosef sees that there's going to, following that, I'm seeing the sunlight is changing, sorry. It's clear that following those 7 years, Yosef sees that there's going to be these 7 years of darkness. But he's gifted with this sense of foresight where he can see that there is impending doom. There's going to be a 7-year famine, which is doom. But instead of getting caught up in that impending doom and darkness, Yosef knows exactly what to do. He's gifted with this foresight of being able to see both of the shades of the future and to know what to do. Yeah, there's going to be 7 years of good and then 7 years to follow. Some of us may be at certain points in our lives like a little bit dumbfounded with that kind of knowledge. Like, wow, the future's going to be extremely bleak. Maybe this sounds a little too resonant right now. And yet, instead of just saying, okay, it's going to be so bleak, chaval, Yosef says, okay, it's going to be so bleak. Now we have 7 years to build these warehouses. So that's exactly what Yosef does. He builds these warehouses, storehouses of grain. And the beauty is that not only does Yosef take care of himself, he decides to build these warehouses of grain that are actually, in the text, going to nourish all of the nations. So he harvests enough that all of the surrounding countries, which are all the nations that the text says, are able to also be sustained for 7 years. So it's not just about Yosef. It's not just about himself. He looks to the future and can provide for the masses. So there's a couple of takeaways from this. I just want to look down at my notes again. Okay, so the thing is about this text is that Yosef's foresight and ability to harvest gives the way for Yosef's brothers, who you probably remember, from up north to come down to Egypt and ask him for grain. So it's because of Yosef's foresight and ability to nourish that ultimately his brothers come down and request grain from him. And although Yosef acts begrudgingly towards them, he holds a grudge and he acts in an unkind way towards them initially, ultimately, these things of his foresight and ability to nourish lead to forgiveness. They lead to the restoration of Yosef and his brothers, as well as to the forgiveness in that family and to that reunification of our ancestral family, his father being Yaakov. So we can see that his foresight led to nourishment in the body and also nourishment in terms of this forgiveness. And there's a couple of takeaways that I want to sit with together from this small tale of Yosef. So the first one's a little bit less abstract than the second. The first one is foresight. So something beautiful about our meditation practice is that it gives us this centeredness. We know that practicing allows us at times to really have an awareness about us that lets us have a bit more of an expansive vision of a given thing, a given moment. In the normal day-to-day, we can get so caught up that our vision contains no expanse. Like a certain encounter or a certain interaction with a person might leave us feeling narrow, or as if we have no resource to take care of, or to come to any kind of solution with the difficulty. But when we practice and we're able to become grounded and centered, then when some difficulty arises, we can see the difficulty, but without getting caught in its rage, we can see the difficulty and maybe sometimes have this expansive moment in the encounter where our practice lends itself to us having this wakeful moment of the thing that can give us ability for foresight. There's a conflict. And instead of being berated by it, sitting with it and pondering it, and then coming up with a really sensible solution, our practice can give us access to that. And it's curious because in the text of Yosef, repeatedly throughout the text, it says that God is with Yosef. And as I was thinking about it in this context, is there perhaps something that signals God's presence with Yosef, maybe meaning there was a divine awareness that Yosef had access to, that Yosef had access to a way of foresight, that he had a blessing and a curse. Like, as we know from Yosef's life, there's a train passing, I'm just gonna wait. As we know from Yosef's life, he saw a lot of darkness. He was able to see a lot of darkness. But since he had this kind of gift of divine awareness, he could see that darkness with the ability of hopeful vision, and not just hopeful vision, but practical hope, what to do. And I think that there's something that we can say that our practice can give us access to that. It's not just Yosef stumbling somehow into this divine gift, but that actually Yosef's story exemplifies something that we each have access to. This gift of resting in our practices in this divine awareness, in this awareness that's coming from a deep center that sometimes we have access to. Our practice can sometimes, spontaneously give rise to these things. I'm not suggesting that suddenly we're all kind of magicians like Yosef seems to be, but there's a way that our practices can center us so much that in certain circumstances we're able to act with practical hope and be a practical visionary, to see impending doom, and not only holding a sense of hope, but holding a sense of, okay, I'm in touch with both sides of the situation. It's not just doom. There are things to do right now. So our practice can give us that grounded awareness and allow us to be living in those ways. The second thing that I want to say is a little bit more abstract. The second thing is that it's curious, this whole situation with Yosef, this whole thing where he becomes Pharaoh's right-hand person and takes on this power and gets to be this visionary who then gathers in the grains in the warehouses. All of this is because Yosef is a dream interpreter. So you might recall that Yosef first becomes a dream interpreter pretty early on in his own dreams. He has these two dreams that trouble his brothers so much that they throw him in a pit, and he goes on this whole journey and finds himself in a prison. And in that prison, there's these two people, and they both have these interesting dreams. And Yosef, even though it takes a pretty long time, Yosef ultimately gains his freedom from prison through interpreting their dreams, because the baker or the cupbearer, can't remember which one dies in prison and which one goes to Pharaoh later. One of them goes to Pharaoh later, and years later remembers Yosef, who's still in prison. And for that reason that Yosef was able to interpret his dream, Pharaoh takes Yosef out of prison, because Pharaoh has had this dream of the skinny cow and the fat cow, and nobody in all of the lands can interpret the dream. But it's in that moment that Pharaoh's servant remembers Yosef from prison, because Yosef had interpreted his dream and that it had come to fruition. So Pharaoh takes Yosef out of prison with the hope that his servant's promise will come through, that Yosef can be relied on as a dream interpreter. So he takes him out of prison, and as we know, Yosef is spot on. He completely interprets Pharaoh's dream in such a profound way, with so much truth, that that's what this whole situation happens. Then Pharaoh's like, wow, this is amazing. You should be the storehouse person, and you're such a visionary. And anyway, I wanted to bring that up because it's very relevant that Yosef's power rests on dream, and it rests on something completely abstract and deeply unconscious. And when Yosef interprets dreams, he says in all of the times he interprets dreams, pardon the helicopter, in all of the times, I hope you can hear me, I'm just gonna wait. Okay, every time Yosef interprets a dream, he says, it's not me, it's God. God is interpreting the dream. I'm just, it's God interpreting the dream. Thank God. It's not me. And, I'm struck, a little bit inconclusively struck by that. And I wanted to leave you with that image of this deep relationship with the unconscious that Yosef holds. He holds this deep and very real relationship with what we call unreal, with the unreality, something that's deep somewhere else. And that space, I think we all of us practitioners are aware of. That space that sometimes our mind can shift to between thoughts, or as we all know from dream, and as we know in therapy and just all sorts of different instances where we encounter the unconscious, it's so real. And from that space, very real practical measures are taken. Yosef saves the world from famine through his relationship with the unconscious. He takes what's deeply, seemingly impractical from the realm of dream itself and makes it into a way out, a way to survive, and a way to forgive his family, and a way to reunite. And that's the blessing that I want to let linger in our Sukkot today and this evening as Yosef sits with us, is this blessing to rest into our own unconscious selves, our hearts and our minds, and maybe even allow the mingling of silence in the midst of our conversation to be pregnant and full of unconsciousness waiting to be birthed, and to give space for that in our Sukkot. Because the more we open our hearts and lean in to that unknown, that complete unconscious wealth of knowledge and hope and practicality for combating future doom, be it in the world or in our personal lives and relationships, we hold these lights and ways out and practical ways to be in harmony with whatever the future presents us. And I wish you success in leaning in to that which you possess effortlessly, and to allow Yosef to remind us of the importance of relating to the unconscious and how real our dream lives can become in the practical world. So I am wishing you an evening of dwelling in the light and presence of Yosef. Chag Sameach from Orot.